Sophie had always been the steady one in the family, the one who could be counted on no matter the situation. Growing up, it was clear that she was the responsible, level-headed sibling, while her younger brother, Matt, was the impulsive one. Sophie often found herself picking up the pieces of Matt's messes, whether it was helping him clean up after a party gone wrong, bailing him out of a financial mess, or covering for him when he failed to show up for important commitments. She never minded though. It was simply part of being a big sister, and she loved Matt despite his faults. Matt, on the other hand, had always felt the pressure of being the problem child. His tendency to make bad decisions was a constant source of tension between him and their parents. Sophie was the golden child, the one who excelled in school, who kept a steady job, who never seemed to make a misstep. Matt often resented her for that, even if he never fully admitted it. Still, there was a bond between them, one that went beyond sibling rivalry. Sophie always felt that Matt could do better if he just applied himself, and she was determined to help him find his way. But that all changed the day Sophie began receiving calls from creditors about unpaid bills. At first, it was just one call. Sophie had missed a couple of calls from an unknown number during the day, but she didn't think much of it. Then when she checked her voicemail that evening, she heard the first message. A stern voice informing her that she had an outstanding balance on a credit card she had never applied for. She was puzzled, confused, and more than a little concerned. Sophie prided herself on being financially responsible. She had no credit card debt, never missed a payment, and had always been cautious with her finances. She immediately called the number back, thinking it must be some sort of mistake. The representative on the other end sounded just as confused as Sophie felt. They confirmed that an application had been made for a credit card in her name, and charges had already been racked up. Sophie tried to explain that she had never opened such an account, but the agent was firm, telling her to file a fraud report and begin the process of clearing her name. It was a hassle, but Sophie was confident it would be resolved quickly. After all, how could anyone steal her identity when she kept such a tight grip on her personal information? She thought about canceling her credit card just in case, but the idea seemed so far-fetched. Surely, this was some mistake, and everything would be fine once she spoke to the right person. But then the calls started coming more frequently. Creditors, collection agencies, even loan companies started reaching out, all regarding accounts and debts Sophie had no knowledge of. Bills piled up in her mailbox, more than she had ever seen in her life. She had never been late on a single payment, but now there were notices from multiple companies, all accusing her of fraudulent activity. Each letter felt like a blow to the gut, a reminder that she was being dragged through a mess that wasn't of her making. She spent hours on the phone with the credit bureaus, trying to explain the situation and clear her name. But the more she tried to solve the problem, the more tangled everything became. Each conversation seemed to dig her deeper into a hole, as she was told to file forms, prove her identity, and submit police reports. It felt like a never-ending process, a labyrinth of bureaucracy designed to frustrate and confuse. As the days passed, the problem only grew worse. Sophie began receiving notifications of loans taken out in her name, loans she had never applied for. The amounts were staggering, tens of thousands of dollars in personal loans, each one accompanied by missed payment notices. She was locked in a nightmare of her own making, yet none of it was her fault. She couldn't understand how this could have happened. She had always been so careful, so protective of her personal information. How could someone have gotten access to her details without her knowing? It was then that Sophie started to notice a pattern. The names on the accounts were all variations of her own name. Small changes, but enough to slip through the cracks. It was as if someone had taken her personal information and carefully manipulated it to create new identities. The realization hit her like a cold slap in the face. This wasn't some random act of identity theft. Someone had been watching her, studying her life, and knew exactly how to replicate her identity. Her first instinct was to think about someone she knew who had the kind of access to her life that could have made this possible. She thought back to the few times she had shared personal details in casual conversation, her address, her social security number, her bank details when helping out with small loans, her passwords that she'd shared when helping Matt with his tech problems. Matt, The thought struck her like a bolt of lightning. Of course, it had to be him. Sophie hadn't wanted to believe it at first. Seemed unthinkable. Matt, her own brother, the one she had always gone out of her way to help, the one she had bailed out of countless bad situations, he would never do something like this. But as the evidence began to mount, the pieces of the puzzle started to fit together. She thought about the times he'd asked for money in the past, claiming he needed a little cash to get by. She thought about his desperation, his need to keep up appearances, and how he often acted without thinking of the consequences. She thought about the time he had asked her for her social security number under the pretense of setting up some sort of shared account. Sophie had complied, thinking it was just another one of Matt's odd requests. But now, looking back, she realized that was the moment he had taken everything he needed to ruin her life. The more she thought about it, the more the pieces aligned. Matt had always been good at manipulating situations to his advantage. He knew how to play people, how to get what he wanted, how to make them feel sorry for him, or think he was a victim. Sophie had spent years cleaning up after him, always making excuses for his behavior, always giving him the benefit of the doubt. But now it seemed clear. Matt had stolen her identity, not out of malice, perhaps, but out of desperation. He had always been reckless, but this was something else entirely. This was a betrayal. The first time Sophie confronted him, she had tried to keep her voice steady. She didn't want to jump to conclusions, didn't want to accuse him without being absolutely sure. But the moment she asked him point-blank if he had anything to do with the fraud, Matt's reaction told her everything. He was defensive, evasive, and downright hostile. He denied everything, of course, just like she knew he would. He accused her of overreacting, of making a mountain out of a molehill. He claimed he had nothing to do with it, and even suggested she was just losing control of her own finances. But Sophie knew better. She knew Matt's patterns, his behavior, his tendency to avoid taking responsibility for his actions. This was no mistake. Matt had stolen her identity, and now, he was willing to let her sink into financial ruin, rather than admit the truth. As the confrontation ended, Sophie realized that her life was about to change forever. She couldn't just let this go. Matt had crossed a line, and she would make him pay for it, one way or another. But what she didn't know yet was how far Matt would go to protect himself from the consequences of his actions, or just how far Sophie was willing to go to get her life back. The battle for her future had only just begun, and Sophie was determined to come out on top. Sophie sat in front of her computer, staring at the screen, as if it were some kind of portal that might hold the key to everything she needed to fix the mess her brother had created. The past week had been a whirlwind of phone calls, emails, and visits to the local police station. Every time she thought she was getting closer to a resolution, something else would surface. A new debt, a new creditor, a new application in her name. Each new discovery felt like a punch to the gut, and each call with the credit agency or law enforcement felt like an uphill battle she wasn't sure she could win. She had always prided herself on being organized, reliable, and in control. But now everything felt completely out of her grasp. The first step she took after confronting Matt had been to file a fraud report with the police. She had hoped that with the evidence she had, the situation would be resolved quickly. She was wrong. The officers at the local precinct had listened to her story, nodded sympathetically, and handed her a stack of forms to fill out. They had assured her that they would investigate, but that it could take weeks, maybe months, before she would know anything for certain. In the meantime, she was instructed to contact the credit bureaus and dispute the fraudulent charges. Sophie had never felt so small in her life. The world that she had once trusted seemed to be falling apart around her, and there was little she could do to stop it. She thought back to her childhood, how her parents had always taught her to be careful with her finances, how she had always been so diligent about paying bills on time, keeping her credit score pristine. All of it felt pointless now, as if none of her efforts had mattered. All it took was one mistake, one betrayal by the one person she should have been able to trust, and everything she had worked so hard for had been destroyed. The first few phone calls to the credit bureaus had been discouraging. Each time she tried to explain that the accounts and loans were not hers, the representatives asked her for more documents, more proof. It felt like they were treating her like a criminal, rather than a victim. They asked her to fax over police reports, to send copies of her driver's license and passport, to verify that she wasn't the one opening up the accounts. It was exhausting. Each time Sophie submitted more paperwork, it felt like she was running in circles, only to be told that she needed to provide something else. Her credit score, once a solid 800, had plummeted into the 400s. Sophie couldn't believe it. She had never missed a payment in her life, and now her entire financial reputation was in shambles. She couldn't get approved for a car loan, couldn't open a new bank account without being asked questions she couldn't answer. She had always prided herself on being financially independent, but now it felt like the rug had been pulled out from under her. Each time she was rejected for something as simple as a new credit card, she felt a little more helpless. Sophie knew she couldn't afford to wait around for the police to solve the problem. She needed to take matters into her own hands. But where to start? She had no experience with this kind of situation. No idea how to fight back against a criminal who was her own flesh and blood. She tried calling her bank again, explaining the situation, but all they could offer were temporary freezes on her accounts and more paperwork to fill out. It was all so overwhelming, and Sophie felt as if she were losing her grip on everything. The days began to blur together as she spent hours on the phone with various companies, trying to convince them that she was the victim, not the perpetrator. But each time it seemed like she was getting nowhere. Then one day she received a strange letter from a loan company. It was addressed to her, but the loan was for a large sum, far larger than anything Sophie would ever have applied for. The loan company had contacted her because they had discovered a default on the loan. The account in question was listed under her name, with no indication that it was fraudulent. Sophie's heart sank as she read the letter, realizing that this loan was just one more piece of evidence that Matt had taken her identity for a ride. It was at that point that Sophie decided to go deeper, to investigate exactly how Matt had pulled off this identity theft. She had known that he was reckless, but she never imagined he was capable of something this calculated. Matt had always been charming when he needed to be, able to manipulate people into believing his sob stories, into giving him money or favors. But this was a whole new level of deceit. Sophie started retracing her steps, trying to figure out how Matt had gained access to her personal information. It was then that the pieces started to fall into place. Sophie remembered the time Matt had asked for her social security number. She had given it to him so he could open a shared account, or so he said. Sophie had trusted him just as she always had. She didn't think twice about it. It was only after the fraud began to surface that she realized how dangerous that trust had been. Matt had known exactly what he was doing. He had known how to exploit the information he had, and he had done it with the precision of someone who understood the system all too well. Sophie spent the next few days combing through her emails, her bank statements, any document she could find that might give her more insight into Matt's methods. She found a series of transactions that raised red flags. Small, incremental purchases from online stores that she had never shopped at. They were all under her name, but the shipping addresses were different, addresses that didn't belong to her. Matt had been using her name to purchase things, and the addresses suggested that he had been reselling these items or using them for his own gain. Sophie felt sick to her stomach. When she went back to the police with the new evidence, they seemed more receptive. The officer she spoke with took notes and assured her that they would open a full investigation into the matter. It was a small victory, but it wasn't enough to make Sophie feel secure. The process was slow, and the legal system was full of loopholes. She couldn't afford to wait months for the investigation to bear fruit. She had to act faster. The next step, Sophie realized, was to confront the banks and credit card companies directly. She made a list of the institutions that had been defrauded and began calling each one. She was polite at first, but after being transferred from department to department, her patience started to wear thin. She explained the situation again and again, always in the same calm tone, but the frustration was palpable. Each representative asked her for the same documents, the same verification, but Sophie wasn't going to give up. She refused to back down. It was during one of these phone calls that she got an idea that might finally help her unravel the mess that Matt had created. She began asking about the possibility of a fraud alert being placed on her credit report. This would flag any new accounts opened in her name, requiring a verification process before they could be approved. She knew that if she could prevent any further fraudulent activity, it would buy her the time she needed to prove her innocence. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was a step in the right direction. The credit bureaus agreed to place the alert, but Sophie knew it wouldn't be enough on its own. She had to keep pushing. With a new sense of resolve, Sophie began gathering evidence, collecting everything she could that pointed to Matt's involvement. She reached out to other victims of identity theft, hoping to find others who had experienced similar fraud schemes. Slowly but surely, she was building a case. She even managed to track down some of Matt's online transactions, tracing them to his account, and proving that he had used her identity without her permission. As the weeks passed, Sophie's life became consumed by the fight to reclaim her identity. The stress of dealing with the bureaucracy, the constant calls from creditors, and the weight of the betrayal from someone she had once trusted more than anyone else took its toll. But Sophie refused to give up. She would fight until the bitter end, determined to restore her life, no matter how long it took. But there was something else, something deeper driving her now. It wasn't just about clearing her name. It was about sending a message to Matt. He had taken everything from her, but she wasn't going to let him get away with it. She would make him face the consequences of his actions. Sophie wasn't just fighting to fix her credit score. She was fighting for her future, for her peace of mind, and for the justice she knew she deserved. Sophie had always been the kind of person who relied on logic and patience. Throughout her life, she had faced challenges with a calm demeanor, her mind focused on finding a solution. It was one of the reasons people trusted her, why she was the one people turned to when things went wrong. But this was different. This wasn't a simple misunderstanding, or a misstep that could be smoothed over with an apology. No, this was a betrayal so deep, so calculated, that it shook her to her core. For the first time in her life, Sophie felt something entirely new: rage. When she had first confronted Matt, she had hoped for some sign of remorse, or at least an apology. She thought that perhaps after being caught, he might fess up to his actions, acknowledge the hurt he had caused, and work to make things right. Instead, he had mocked her, dismissed her concerns, and turned the blame back onto her. Sophie could almost hear the arrogance in his voice as he said, "You're overreacting, sophomore. It's just a few bills. You'll figure it out." That was when she realized that Matt didn't care. He didn't care about the consequences of his actions, didn't care that he had destroyed her life. He only cared about protecting himself. That moment, sitting in the dim light of her apartment, staring at the phone as she replayed the conversation in her head, something shifted inside Sophie. She wasn't just going to let him ruin everything she had worked for without a fight. She wasn't going to let him walk away scot-free. While her life continued to spiral into chaos, she had always been the one cleaning up his messes, always the one bailing him out of trouble. But this time it was different. This time, she would be the one in control. At first, Sophie had no idea how to go about turning the tables on Matt. He had stolen her identity, ruined her credit, and caused untold emotional distress. And yet the authorities seemed to be moving at a glacial pace. The paperwork piled up, the fraud alerts were ignored, and the creditors kept calling. But Sophie had learned a lot in the past few weeks. She had learned that this was no ordinary case of identity theft. This was a game that Matt had been playing for years, a game that he thought he could win. But Sophie wasn't about to be another victim. If Matt thought he could outsmart her, he had another thing coming. Sophie spent the next few days in overdrive, methodically gathering information. She knew that if she was going to beat Matt at his own game, she needed to be smart. He had been good at hiding his tracks, but Sophie was even better at uncovering the truth. She began by retracing her steps once again, going over everything Matt had done to exploit her identity. She spent hours on the phone with banks, tracking down every account that had been opened in her name, every transaction that had been made. She made copies of every document, every email, and every conversation she had with the credit bureaus and law enforcement. She wasn't going to leave anything to chance. But it wasn't enough just to clear her name. Sophie knew she needed to hit Matt where it hurt the most. She had already been to the police, already filed a fraud report, But she knew that legal battles could take months, maybe even years. Matt was good at slithering out of consequences, good at evading the law. And Sophie wasn't about to let that happen. She had to think bigger, more devious. If Matt wanted to play games, Sophie was ready to turn the tables and play on his level. The first step was to strike back at his finances. Sophie had access to the documentation that proved Matt had opened accounts in her name. She had all the proof she needed to show that he was behind the fraudulent activity. But she didn't just want to expose him to the authorities. She wanted him to feel the consequences, in a way, that would make him realize the severity of what he had done. She began gathering information about Matt's own finances. Sophie knew he had always struggled with money, always looking for shortcuts and ways to get by without working too hard. It was time to use that to her advantage. She started by contacting some of Matt's creditors, those who had no idea that he was juggling multiple accounts and living on borrowed money. Sophie didn't exactly know what she was going to do with this information yet, but she knew she could use it later. She also started making anonymous tips to people in Matt's personal and professional life, people who didn't know the truth about Matt's reckless behavior. She didn't care about the morality of it, she cared about the outcome. The more people that learned about his financial mismanagement and deceit, the harder it would be for him to continue his charade. But that was just the beginning. Sophie knew she had to hit Matt where it truly hurt, his reputation. She had spent years watching Matt manipulate people, make them feel sorry for him, or get what he wanted by exploiting their trust. He had a network of friends, family, and colleagues who all thought he was the charming, easygoing guy who could do no wrong. Sophie knew this. And she knew that it was time to tear down the facade he had so carefully constructed. Sophie began working her way through Matt's social circle, dropping subtle hints here and there about his latest schemes. She didn't have to outright accuse him. She just needed to plant the seed of doubt. She spoke to mutual friends who had always been too loyal to Matt to question his actions. She told them about the fraudulent accounts, the shady loans, the way he had used her name to get ahead. At first, they were hesitant to believe it, but slowly, they began to question him. Sophie wasn't trying to destroy Matt's life completely. She just wanted him to feel the weight of the truth. She wanted him to see that his lies had caught up with him. Then came the moment that Sophie had been waiting for. Matt's reaction. As expected, he denied everything, as if he could still control the narrative. When he confronted Sophie, he was angry, defensive, and irrational. "You're crazy, Soph," he said, his voice rising. "Why are you doing this to me? I'm your brother. I've always been there for you." Sophie stood her ground, her expression unwavering. "You've always been there for me? Really? Because I don't remember asking you to steal my identity. I don't remember asking you to destroy my life." Matt floundered, his usual confidence slipping as the reality of what he had done began to sink in. Sophie could see the cracks in his facade, could see the fear creeping in as people around him began to question his actions. He had spent so long being the center of attention, so long manipulating people with his charm and lies, that he never expected anyone to turn the tables on him. But Sophie was no longer the naive sister who cleaned up his messes. She was someone else now. Someone stronger, someone smarter, someone who had learned the hard way that sometimes the only way to win was to fight dirty. It was during this time that Sophie discovered something that would become her ultimate weapon: Matt's hidden financial dealings. She had managed to uncover a series of shady transactions. Money transfers, loans, even investments in risky ventures, all linked back to him. He had always been secretive about his finances, but now, Sophie had the evidence she needed to make everything unravel. Sophie didn't go to the authorities with this new information, not yet. She had learned that the law moved slowly, and Matt was still too slick for the system to catch him. But Sophie had no such limitations. She began reaching out to people in Matt's business world, sharing the evidence of his poor financial decisions, his risky investments, and his lies. She made sure the right people knew just how much trouble Matt was in. The more people who knew about his deceit, the more pressure he would feel, the more isolated he would become. It was a game now, a game of chess, and Sophie was ready to make her next move. Every time Matt tried to turn the tables on her, she had already planned her response. Every time he tried to manipulate the situation, she was one step ahead. Sophie had learned from the best, after all. Matt had been playing the game of deceit for years, and now, Sophie was playing it better. And as the walls slowly began to close in on him, Sophie realized that she wasn't just fighting for her own freedom. She was fighting for justice. Justice for the years of manipulation, the years of lies, and the years of pain that Matt had caused her. It wasn't just about clearing her name anymore. It was about making sure Matt paid for what he had done. He had underestimated her. But Sophie wasn't going to let him get away with it. Not this time. The game had changed, and she was no longer the pawn. The days had bled into weeks, and Sophie had become a master at playing the long game. She had learned to anticipate Matt's every move, to stay one step ahead, as she carefully maneuvered through the maze of lies and deception he had built around her. The more she uncovered, the more she realized how deep his treachery ran. This was not just about some bad decisions, or some reckless spending. It was a full-fledged scheme. He had been manipulating people for years, hiding behind his charm and his smooth talk. But now, with every ounce of energy she had, Sophie was determined to bring him down. She had been playing nice for too long, giving him the benefit of the doubt. But that was over now. She was ready to take her final stand. The final weeks before Sophie's confrontation with Matt had been spent gathering evidence. She had enlisted the help of a few trusted friends, those who knew Matt's personality well enough to know how easily he could manipulate others. They had shared stories with Sophie, stories about his deceitful behavior, his gambling, his tendency to use people for his own gain. These people, once Matt's closest allies, had now turned against him. They saw the destruction he had caused in Sophie's life and could no longer turn a blind eye. One by one, they came forward, and their testimonies provided Sophie with the ammunition she needed to force Matt into a corner. But it wasn't just the testimonies that Sophie had collected. It was the information about Matt's financial dealings that had become her trump card. She had spent countless hours poring over documents, tracking down accounts that he had opened in her name, digging through transactions that showed just how deeply he had plunged himself into debt. She had found out that he was involved in illegal money-lending schemes, using her identity to take out loans that he couldn't repay. She had discovered that he had been selling high-end items under her name, profiting from the transactions without her knowledge. The web of lies had grown too vast for him to hide. But the most damning evidence was something Sophie hadn't expected to find. A series of emails that revealed Matt had been planning to leave the country. He had made arrangements to flee the moment the situation became untenable. It was a desperate move, but Sophie understood it perfectly. He had been so sure of his ability to manipulate the system, to keep the facade up long enough for him to escape. But Sophie had caught him just in time. When Sophie confronted Matt, she was calm, collected, almost unnervingly so. She knew that if she allowed her emotions to take over, she would lose the control she had worked so hard to regain. She had learned that revenge wasn't about yelling or fighting. It was about making the person who had wronged you face the truth. And Matt would face the truth whether he wanted to or not. It was early afternoon when she arrived at Matt's apartment. He was home just as she had expected. The blinds were drawn and the place was silent, eerily so. When Sophie knocked, it was almost as if Matt had been waiting for her. He opened the door, his usual confident smile stretching across his face. But this time, Sophie wasn't fooled by his charm. She had seen through him. She could feel his unease, despite the mask of calm he tried to maintain. "Sophie, what's this all about?" Matt asked, his voice a little too casual. "You know you're making this a bigger deal than it needs to be." Sophie stepped inside without waiting for an invitation. She could tell that Matt was trying to control the situation, but she wasn't going to let him. She had all the evidence she needed, and she wasn't afraid to use it. "No, Matt," she said, her voice steady but firm. "This isn't just some misunderstanding. You stole from me. You destroyed my life. And now, you're going to face the consequences." Matt's expression faltered for a split second, and Sophie knew she had him. He hadn't expected her to come at him so directly. He stepped back slightly, glancing nervously at the door, as if he were contemplating running. But he didn't. Instead, he tried to regain control, plastering on a smirk. "You're being dramatic, Soph. I didn't steal anything from you. We're family, remember?" Matt's words were laced with a hint of mockery, but there was fear in his eyes, a fear Sophie hadn't seen before. You've been stealing from me for months, Matt, Sophie replied, pulling out a folder from her bag. These are the documents that prove it. Every loan you took out in my name. Every account you opened. You've used my identity to get ahead, and now I'm done with it. She spread out the papers on the table before him. Matt looked at them, his expression slowly morphing from one of cocky defiance to pure panic. He flipped through the papers quickly, his hands trembling as he saw the names of creditors, the amounts, the dates of the fraudulent transactions. His face paled, and he sank into the couch behind him, unable to speak. Sophie could feel the power shift in the room. The tables had turned. This time, it wasn't her that was on the back foot. This time, she was the one who held the power. But Sophie wasn't finished. She knew that Matt had always been good at escaping consequences. He was a master at wriggling out of tight situations, and she had to make sure that didn't happen again. She pulled out the final piece of her plan. The emails that revealed his intentions to leave the country. You were planning to run, weren't you? She said, her voice cool and composed. You thought you could get away with it all, leave the country, abandon everything, and let me deal with the fallout. Matt didn't answer. His silence spoke volumes. Sophie took a deep breath, steadying herself for the final blow. I've already spoken to the authorities, Matt. I've filed a full report and they're investigating. But don't think I'm just going to sit back and let you escape. I've made sure people know about your schemes, your gambling, and the way you've been exploiting me for years. The walls are closing in, Matt. For a moment, Matt said nothing. He sat there, staring at Sophie with a mix of disbelief and anger. Sophie could see the gears turning in his mind as he tried to figure out what his next move should be. But he was out of options. There was nowhere left for him to run. You're crazy, Matt spat, his voice low and venomous. You really think you can destroy me like this? You think anyone will believe you? You're nothing without me. Sophie stood up, her eyes never leaving his. I don't need you anymore, Matt. You've taken enough from me. Now it's time for you to face the consequences. I'm done being your punching bag. The look on Matt's face twisted from anger to something Sophie hadn't expected. Genuine fear. He knew he was cornered, and this time there was no way out. As Sophie turned to leave, she paused by the door. She didn't want to walk away without one final piece of closure. Just remember this, Matt, she said, her voice cold and steady. The game you've been playing is over. You might have thought you could ruin my life, but you've forgotten one thing. I'm smarter than you, and I'm not the same person I was before. You underestimated me, and that's going to cost you everything. With that, she walked out of his apartment, leaving Matt in the silence of his own making. Sophie didn't know what the future would hold. She didn't know how long it would take for the legal process to catch up to him. But one thing was certain, Matt had lost. He had tried to destroy her, but Sophie had fought back, and she had won. Sophie's life wasn't perfect. It would take time to repair the damage Matt had done. The road ahead would be long, filled with challenges and setbacks. But Sophie knew now that she could overcome anything. She had learned the hard way that the only person who could truly control her life was herself. And no one, no matter how close they were, would ever be allowed to take that away from her again. As she stepped out into the sunlight, Sophie took a deep breath, ready for whatever came next. She had been through hell and back, and she was stronger for it. The worst was over, and she had emerged victorious. The battle was won. Now it was time to move on.